Hello and welcome to my channel, In Search of Wonder. My name is Anne and today I have some recommendations of how to read like Jane Austen. I apologize in advance for two things. One, this video is late and I am going to have, well, late according to my personal timeline of when I intended to have it uploaded. And I am not going to have time to edit it. So it is going to be unedited, raw. This is me stumbling over my words and umming and all of that kind of stuff. So apologize for that. The other thing is there is an annoying fly flying around and I never know when he's going to make an appearance. So if you hear a little buzzing, that's the fly, our little friend, the fly. Me and my obstinate headstrong girl mug with my decaf coffee because it is 9:30 at night. We are going to share with you some recommendations of books that Jane Austen read that you might also enjoy. These are all books that I have personally read. I'm going to close with a few books that I have not read, but I've definitely put on my TBR for one reason or another. So let's get started. Jane Austen was, of course, widely read. She had read many of the classics, fiction and nonfiction, in her era. She also read the popular books. It seems like she read many books when they came out, when they were published. So she had ready access to the popular literature of her day, and she was far from being an elitist or a snob when it came to her reading. In fact, she spoke often in defense of novels and even Gothic romances, which of the day were like genre fiction of our day, looked down by the more literary elite readers of her time as being low fiction. So she was widely read and she was not elitist, she was not snobbery. So there's a wide selection to choose from. I pulled from several different internet lists of books that we know for sure that Jane Austen read because she mentioned them, either in her books by name or by quoting from them, or it's obvious from context, or she wrote about them in her letters, again, either by title, or she mentioned the author, or she quoted from the books, or she referenced them in some obvious way. So we know she read these books. We can infer from that she probably read other books by the same authors, but the ones I'm going to mention today are definitely ones we know for sure that Jane Austen read. If you are participating in my Reading the Classics challenge for this year, the challenge for July was to read like Jane Austen, to coordinate with the Jane Austen July readathon, which is a favorite for so many of us. And reading like Jane Austen simply means reading a book that she would have read or could have read. I'm not picky about it. But today I'm going to share with you books that we know for sure that Austen read. And I apologize, I did not get this out sooner. Life, that's all I can say. First of all, the first one I want to mention is a favorite author of Jane Austen was Frances Burney. And Frances Burney wrote several novels, and three of them have the title of the heroine as the title of the book. And so Cecilia is one, and Evelina is another, and Camilla is a third. Evelina is the first one that I read by Frances Burney, and I really enjoyed it. I found it amusing and funny. There was a lot of like slapstick sort of comedy in there, and it was just a fun story, a bit of a fun ride. So I enjoyed Evelina by Frances Burney and can definitely recommend that. I don't remember what rating I gave it, maybe like 4 stars. I'm not 100% sure, but Evelina is about a young woman who heads to London and encounters, the high life of society there, and it also recounts her journey to finding the man that she ends up marrying and their relationship as it develops, and also the other men that she runs into and the experiences that she has along the way. And her innocence and naivety lead to some interesting circumstances and situations in which she finds herself. So it makes for fun reading, and I enjoyed it. I did observe some influences on Austen's writing in Evelina when I read it. Same with Cecilia, which was part of our 250th anniversary celebration of Jane Austen. Earlier this year, I think February maybe, we read Cecilia by Frances Burney. And that one was much longer than Evelina, if I remember correctly. And I think many of us who read it would agree with this assessment that it was very wordy. It could have used some really good editing. Back in the day, they didn't edit books in the same way we have editors today who really cut back an author's work and streamline it and clarify it. They didn't have it in the same way back then, is my understanding. And I do believe that Cecilia could have used some serious editing, because there was there were some extra characters that I don't think were necessary. Although, you know, one or two of them, like, they provided some comic relief. Some of the scenes and scenarios were really very long, drawn out, much longer than they needed to be. And it's like she was milking the drama for all it was worth. And it just lended to a contrived feeling to the story at times. But it was interesting, and I am glad I read it. I didn't like it as much as Evelina, but I did enjoy the reading. It was a bit deeper than Evelina in some ways, and that I feel like it tackled probably some of its themes in a more meaningful way than perhaps Evelina did. Evelina did it more humorously, I guess, and Cecilia was more in earnest. And Cecilia was herself a very earnest character. And so, yeah, that's where I would put that one. I have not read anything else, any other of her novels. So Camilla is the next one that I want to read. So I can't say anything about that, but it's on my list to read. And then I will have read, well, I think there's one more. The Wanderer, I think, is another one that she wrote. But also her memoirs and journals, etc., have been published as well. And so I have read the Diary of Frances Burney, and that I highly recommend. I don't think that Austen would have read that, because I don't think it was published. I think it was published after Frances Burney's death, and Frances Burney lived longer than Austen. She outlived Austen, if my mental dates are correct. But Austen probably would not have read her journals and diaries, but they are so fascinating and so interesting. She had such an interesting life, and she knew so many interesting people, and she lived through some very rapidly changing times in history, including the French Revolution and King George's descent into insanity. And so she had a first-hand and a front row seat to these happenings and these events, these historic events. So it's really interesting to read it. So I personally highly recommend Frances Burney's Diary as an interesting read. Another novelist that Jane Austen really enjoyed, in fact, was probably her most favorite novelist of all, that was Maria Edgeworth. And Maria Edgeworth is often considered nowadays to be an Irish novelist. Like, she focused on Irish issues, and that's true. But one of her books, which I think was her debut novel, was Belinda, which is the first book that I read by her. And I don't believe that really tackles Ireland or Irish issues at all. I think it's more of like a courtship story, and it tackles maybe some themes of, particular to London high society, but I don't think it really delves into the Irish issue very much. Correct me if I'm wrong if you've read it, but I don't think so. It is a very interesting story, and some of those characters have stuck with me to this day. Belinda, the main character, and then because Lady Delacour is her name, very interesting character that you can see evidence of her influence on Austen's writing and the characters that Austen developed. And there's another character, I forget her name. I want to say it's Harriet something or other. Also incredibly interesting character in the story. Very surprising. At least it was surprising to me. She was a very, for lack of a better word, she was like a very manly sort of woman. She behaved in a very masculine way for that time. And she had a very brusque personality, and she like was who she was, took her at face value. I believe she even wore pants of some kind, trousers of some kind, rather than dresses. And, you know, she was like, and she was based on a real woman of the time, of the London society. So I found that very interesting. I also read The Absentee by Maria Edgeworth, and that was very good. It wasn't as memorable, in my opinion, as Belinda, because I don't remember much about it. And it tackled the issue of English landlords of Irish estates who never went to their properties. And so they kind of just trusted the oversight of it to stewards or whatever, but never made sure that the people were actually being taken care of, you know. And there were tenants and lands and villages associated with their properties that they just abandoned. And that's the issue that she was tackling in this story, which I wasn't aware of. So in that sense, it was very interesting to read about it and to have some insight from that time period about what was happening then and the difficulties that it created. So from a historical perspective and learning about historical events, I think it's a very valuable story. But as a story in and of itself, for me, it was a little bit on the forgettable side, but it was very well written, and it wasn't like super difficult to understand or to keep track with. Like, it was readable, you know. So I do want to read more by Maria Edgeworth. I definitely am not going to stop with just those two. Castle Rackrent is one of her most famous ones. That is definitely on my list of books that I would like to read by her. I don't know much about it, and I've heard mixed things. Some people have really hated it, but it's often considered one of her best works. So I would like to try it and see what happens. Ann Radcliffe was another favorite author of Jane Austen, and she famously both satirized and defended Ann Radcliffe's novels and the whole Gothic romance genre in her book, Northanger Abbey. And I have so far read The Romance of the Forest, and I enjoyed it. I didn't love it, but I didn't hate it. I had never read like a Gothic romance story before. So as an example of that genre, it was very interesting and amusing, although perhaps it wasn't always supposed to be amusing, but sometimes it ended up being amusing. But it was interesting. I mean, the plot, it takes you through a variety of circumstances and settings, and some of them are indeed quite creepy. Our modern sensibilities, I think, have been a little bit desensitized, so I don't think it's quite as creepy for the modern reader, but it definitely has like graveyard moments and skeletons in the basement kind of situations, and creepy male relatives and that kind of nonsense going on. So, you know, the main heroine, her virtue is at stake, that sort of thing. Definitely has all of those hallmarks of a Gothic romance, and so it was very interesting, and some moments of it were quite memorable as well. I next want to read The Mysteries of Udolpho by her, which is specifically named in Northanger Abbey and is one of her most famous works. I also want to read The Italian. That was on my TBR earlier this year, and I just never got to it. But I definitely want to read more works by Ann Radcliffe. And I want to be a little more attentive when I'm reading them this time. I read, and I will mention this book again probably, but Jane Austen's Bookshelf by Rebecca Romney had some good insight as to Ann Radcliffe's writings, and she was very well appreciated in her day. She was likened to Shakespeare, and many people considered her as much a poet as an author because she wove such beautiful poetry into her prose. And actually, The Romance of the Forest did contain lines of poetry that she had written, but I think that they also mean like her descriptions of landscape and that kind of thing her setting descriptions, that kind of stuff, was considered, to be very poetic in nature. And that was one of the things many people loved about her writing. So I will keep that more in mind when I pick up the next book that I read by her. Another very popular author, or a favorite author of Jane Austen's, one that she very much admired, was Samuel Richardson. And I've only read one by him. I kind of want to read his other books, but I don't know if I'm really up for that. By the way, I have a copy of The Romance of the Forest. This Oxford World's Classic. But Pamela by Samuel Richardson, if you have been following me all this year, you might remember I read this in January, and it was interesting for sure. This isn't necessarily one I'm recommending. It's just a book I know that Austen read and that I read, and so I'm telling you, and you can read it if you dare. That's all I'll say about that one. Another one, The Vicar of Wakefield by Oliver Goldsmith, which, by the way, I feel like every classic author has read this book, which is very interesting because it is the only full-length fiction book that Oliver Goldsmith wrote. I think he may have written some other like fables and shorter stories, but this is his only full-length novel of sorts. Otherwise, his work was mostly nonfiction. And I do believe that Jane Austen read some of his nonfiction as well. I'm quoted from it in reference. I have not read any of his nonfiction. I don't know if I'm particularly interested in it, and I am glad I read The Vicar of Wakefield, but as a novel, it is a little bit lacking, in my opinion. And I have seen where experts have categorized it instead as more of a fable type of story, which I can see. I feel like halfway through the story, the tone of the narration changes significantly. There's an abrupt shift. And I think it was intentional on the part of the author, of Oliver Goldsmith. And I think it's because of what he was saying and the themes he was working on and the format that he was using for his story. But it is a little bit jarring for the modern reader. However, it is easy to read, and it doesn't suffer from the excessive verbiage that so many of books from that era do suffer from. So some people really love it, and some people think that it's ridiculously stupid. I'm somewhere in between the two in that I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the process of reading it. I enjoyed the story, but I feel like it's lacking a little bit in the craft personally. One more novel that I want to mention is Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, which Austen read, apparently. And I would assume she read other books by Daniel Defoe as well, if she read that one. And I have read that one. It's not my favorite classic novel. My boys had to read that in school a few years back, and at the beginning they hated it. It was really, really difficult for them to get into it. But now they look back on it with fondness, like they enjoyed it. To one extent or another. So it's not a terrible book, but it is very detailed. It's very detailed. And yeah, I don't really like survival stories anyway, so it's not really my thing, but it's definitely a classic for a reason. And if you haven't read it, it's worth reading for sure. Especially if you have an interest in classic novels, it's definitely an important one. So I recommend for those reasons. As for plays, I mean, Shakespeare, right? Like in Mansfield Park, Austen talks about through the mouth of one of the characters. I think, is it Tom Bertram or Edmund Bertram? They are saying that basically if you're English, you love Shakespeare, like as part of the English Constitution, I think is how they put it. So of course, Austen was very familiar with Shakespeare. She quoted multiple of his plays and referenced them in her books. And so can't go wrong with Shakespeare. I have personally read, I don't know, I'm just gonna throw out a number, let's say 10 of his plays, and I'm steadily working through them, reading 1 or 2 a year. And I should probably pick up that pace a little bit, but I do enjoy his plays when I do read them, and I enjoy watching them performed live whenever I have the chance for that. But also, there were a couple of other playwrights that, Austen read a lot of plays and or was able to see them performed live. She and her siblings also performed them when she was young in their family's barn. So she was very familiar with a lot of plays. Another playwright I will mention is Richard Sheridan. Now, I have not read his plays since I was in high school. It was part of my required reading in high school, a couple of his plays. And I remember finding them humorous and funny, but beyond that, I don't remember much about them. So I should revisit Richard Sheridan's plays. He's definitely earned a place in the top tier of playwrights from that era. And one other I want to mention is Elizabeth Inchbald. I've only read so far The Lover's Vows by her, and I thought it was funny, and I really enjoyed it. I've read it twice now, and so I definitely recommend Lover's Vows. And the nice thing about plays is they're typically like pretty quick reads, and yeah, this one is fun. It has, you know, it has some drama, you might say melodrama, but it also has a lot of humor, and it's touching, although it tends more towards the farcical, I guess, than anything else. But it is a fun read. I really enjoyed Lover's Vows. And then poetry. So John Milton was a favorite poet of Austen's. I have his Paradise Lost, which I read and really enjoyed. I also have this copy of Milton's minor poems. So Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, I think, are, you know, long form poems, but these are his shorter poems or minor poems. And so I do want to read these eventually. Austen references Paradise Lost and some of his minor poems in her works, and I really enjoyed his poetry. William Cowper is another one that was a favorite of hers, and she quoted his poem The Task in, I think, Sense and Sensibility. I have to say, that is the sort of poetry that I struggle with, because I think there's a lot of symbolism in that one, a lot of imagery, a lot of undertones and secondary meanings, a lot of subtext. And I think a decent amount of that just went over my head, and I found the poem itself to be extremely repetitive and meandering. So that's more on me than on the poem itself, I think, because I think I just don't understand the true value of it, because I know many people speak with profound respect for this poem by William Cowper, and I have since, reading it, I have seen commentary on it that, while not 100% convincing me, has informed me that I was missing out on some aspects of the poem that would give it more value than I initially ascribed to it. So I did not enjoy reading The Task. One of these days I might tackle it again with fresher eyes, or maybe with a little help in the reading of it, but suffice it to say, William Cowper is a poet that Austen really loved. And of course, that is not an exhaustive list. Those are just the authors and playwrights and poets that I also have read and enjoyed and can, for the most part, recommend to you. A couple more books that I haven't mentioned yet that I do want to read, and I am indebted to, let's turn that the right way, Jane Austen's bookshelf by Rebecca Romney for some of these suggestions. She definitely mentioned some books in here that I had either never heard of, or I'd heard of, but, you know, had never thought, well, I really want to read that one. And after her describing them and talking about them, I put them on my TBR. Or, I can't remember where I was going with that, but I'm not editing this. So that, you know, that hanging sentence is just going to hang there, and none of us will ever know what I was going to say after that or. It's gone. But anyway, suffice it to say, I have a couple recommendations that came from other sources as well, but definitely this one. I highly recommend reading Jane Austen's bookshelf if you are a fan of Jane Austen and you want to find more about the books that she enjoyed. One of them is The Female Quixote by Charlotte Lennox. And that one is exactly what it sounds like. It's a riff off Don Quixote, a retelling, if you will, but it's based on a contemporary girl at the time that Charlotte Lennox was writing this, who is reading Gothic romances, that sort of thing, kind of like Northanger Abbey, right? And so she imagines, you know, that real life is like these romances that she reads, and so she then begins to act on them as if it was real. So I have not actually read it. When I initially heard about it, I didn't think it didn't sound that interesting to me as a plot, but the more I read about it in Jane Austen's bookshelf, the more it intrigued me, and so definitely moved up my TBR priority list. I already mentioned I want to read The Mysteries of Udolpho by Ann Radcliffe with some new perspective on her writing. And then Camilla as well by Frances Burney. Another one is Emmeline by Charlotte Smith, or another one that she is famous for, The Old Manor House. Charlotte Smith is an author that is discussed at length in Jane Austen's bookshelf. And I had heard about Emmeline from another book I read. And I can't even remember if it was a fiction book or a nonfiction book that I had read, but I definitely had heard about Emmeline and it sounded intriguing to me as a story. So I am hoping to read that one at some point. And right now, as of this moment, I cannot even tell you what it's about. I just know it sounded interesting and I wanted to read it. And then a novel by Elizabeth Inchbald, which I did not realize. I thought she only wrote plays, but she did write a novel called A Simple Story. And what I've heard is that the first half of the story is really delightful. And if it stopped there, it would be great. But then the second volume is the second generation, and apparently that story is not as compelling as the first one. But again, that may be someone else's perspective and not mine. I'm interested in reading it and finding out. I also don't know if, some people said that they really appreciated, like back in the day, especially contemporary critics, loved the way Elizabeth Inchbald brought her skill in playwriting into novel writing, because it really helped to communicate the emotion and feeling and the setting, etc., of the story in a way that novelists weren't really doing at that time. So I think that will be interesting to kind of catch a glimpse of that. One other book that I want to mention before I wrap this up is The Gossip Story by Jane West. And I'm also interested in reading some other books by Jane West. I found Jane West when I was looking for books that Austen read that I could read for July to put on my TBR. And I've got to be honest, my primary goal was to find something that was shorter because I didn't want to put another long book on my schedule. I just wasn't feeling up for that. So I was looking for shorter works. And I came across this one, A Gossip Story, which the basic premise of the plot is identical to Sense and Sensibility. Now, the execution of it is completely different. The actual story and the things that happen are completely different. Sense and Sensibility is definitely Austen's own work through and through. However, the very basic premise of two sisters, one who is sensible, one who is romantic, etc., is the whole basic idea of the gossip story, and obviously also a Sense and Sensibility. I am enjoying it so far. I will have more thoughts about it when I do my weekly reading wrap-ups, but it's very interesting. It's definitely not the same story as Sense and Sensibility, but I can definitely see where Austen was inspired by the themes and the ideas here. So that is all I have. If you have read other books that you know Jane Austen also read and loved, put them in the comments below so that we can all get some more suggestions and ideas of books to read like Jane Austen, because we don't need to confine it to just this month. We can read like Jane Austen anytime, right? Especially this year in our 250th anniversary celebration. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.